Hey, listener, welcome to episode number 108 of Listen Up. You are in training for something bigger. You may have heard me use that line in the past. If you've been here a while, I repeat it often. It's a mantra that I live by. And it's a mantra that I received one day at the last day of the year in 2017 when my family got stuck on a mountain. We almost fell off a cliff and we had to climb up to safety. I'm going to spare you the details of that story, but I did write a book about it. It's called Looking Over the Edge. And what prompted me to write that book was that line that it was like a realization that I had. Oh my God, you are always in training for something bigger. But I have a confession to make today. I've always had an issue with one word in that sentence, and that word is the bigger word. Because that is how I received the line. You are in training for something bigger. And yet I question, what does bigger mean? Does bigger mean bigger tragedy, bigger crisis, bigger pain? Like what is bigger? Bigger could mean good things, but it could also mean bad things. So I've kind of struggled with that sentence, thinking like, does this suggest that life is only going to get harder as life goes by? And yet I've never changed it because it's the sentence that came to my heart in that moment. And I've always set out to understand what it means, knowing that when it came to me, I didn't fully understand it, but I understand it now. And that's what today's episode is about. I want to share with you because this may be the perspective shift that you need in your life. If you've ever dealt with a difficult circumstance or a challenge or something that you're still trying to derive the lesson from, and you think about that sentence, you are in training for something bigger. And if you have that question of like, what does bigger mean? And is bigger always better? Today's episode is going to answer that. So you may already know that I recently faced a very difficult situation with my sister, who I've actually interviewed her on this podcast a few months ago. She had to have open heart surgery, and it was going to be very complicated. It was a very rare condition, nothing to do with her lifestyle. And we were facing a really scary situation with her surgery. So my sister was operated at University of Miami Hospital, which is the same hospital that my father was treated for all of his illnesses and diagnoses over the course of many, many years when he was alive. So I am very familiar with that hospital. And on the day of her surgery, I found myself in the same hospital, in the same waiting room. When the doctor called us to tell us everything was okay, I was standing in the exact same spot that I stood when I received many diagnoses about my father, some good, some not so good. So it was a moment in time that I remembered and that I relived from my past. So I was noticing that the entire time that I was in the hospital, like from the very beginning when I got there, it was all very familiar. Like I have been here before. It was different people, different circumstances, a different patient, but the situation was so familiar to me. So the surgery went well. She did well. Eventually, she was taken out of ICU and she was put on a floor in the cardiac unit and given a room. And when I got to the floor, it was the same floor that my father was always put in. Even though he wasn't always a cardiac patient, for whatever the reason, whenever he was operated in that hospital, his doctor always assigned him to the cardiac unit. So that was the floor that he was always at, no matter what procedure he was there for. And very possibly the same room that he had been in. I don't remember the room exactly, but it was very possible the same room. It was the same room that he had been in. So I get to the room and I remembered a story that I had shared recently. And if I shared this story with you, like if you listen to this podcast and you have my number or you have my email, and I have shared this story with you in the past, please reach out to me and let me know, because I have been beating my head over trying to figure out who it is that I shared this story with just very recently, because very recently I told this story, and I've told it many, many, many times before, about my father and the hospital room with the sign in front of his door. Okay, so if you don't know the story, I have to tell you the story. 15 years ago, my father goes in for surgery. He gets out. He's put in this room. And all of a sudden, he is looking at the wall in front of him that had a TV and a sign. And he got infuriated. And he said, I need you to take that sign off of that wall. Like, you have to cover that sign. So I look at the sign and I'm like, it's a smoking sign, Dad. Like, what is the problem? I don't understand. And he says, Caroline, that sign says quit now. I am not going to be looking at a sign that is encouraging me to quit while I am supposed to be recovering. At the time, I did not think it was that big of a deal, but I obeyed my father and I made sure to cover the sign and whatever. And that story stuck with me forever, ever, 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 because I always looked at that as seeing in my father how seriously he took language, subliminal messaging, and what you tell your brain to believe, to think about, what you tell your subconscious to think about. I was always moved by that story. So I have shared that story many times. So anyway, on this day, I'm with my sister and we are put in a room that could very well be the same room that my father was in. And I go to lay her down in the bed and I look. I couldn't help myself. I look to see if the sign was there. And the sign was still there. 15 years later, the same sign. Quit now. Stop smoking, blah, 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 blah. So I share that story with my sister, but now I am a trained woman. I know better, right? You are always in training for something bigger. So I already knew what to do. I grab the sign, I flip it over, I get a black Sharpie, and on the white part, I write, you are healing. You are strong. You are resilient. And I left it there for my sister. Now, a couple days later, my sister looked at me and said, you have no idea how many times I've read those lines in the last few days. And I was like, so grateful that I could give her that gift. Can you imagine if she had been reading quit now, consciously or unconsciously? Quit now. Maybe her experience would have been a little different. Maybe she would have just blocked it out. Who knows? But I'd like to believe that those affirmations supported her. Those sentences supported her recovery. So as I'm telling my sister this story about my father, and I'm sharing with her all the familiarity, all the similarities about being in that hospital, in that waiting room, in front of the doctor, on the floor, in the room, with the sign. My sister said something so kind to me. She looked at me gently and she said, I'm so sorry, sis, if this triggered some painful memories for you. I wouldn't want to be the cause of you having painful memories. And when she said that, I thought about it and I realized they weren't painful memories. They were beautiful memories. Some were sad. My dad died in that hospital. But throughout his years of hospital stays, my father found a way of bringing humor and playfulness and joy to every situation. He was an inspiration to me. I was always in awe of his determination, of his strong will, of his courage. He never ceased to amaze me. He fought so hard. I remember once in that very room, the doctor came in and was looking at his chart, and he says, "Oh, you have been through cancer. So I see you had prostate cancer." And then he says, "Oh, I see you had kidney cancer too. Oh, and then you had bladder cancer. Oh, and now you're here for a triple bypass." He says, "Man, you've been through a lot." My father looked at him and he said, "I've been knocked down a couple times, but I'm still in the ring." So my father just found a way to make even the most unpleasant circumstances pleasant. And those are the memories that I have chosen to bring with me. Those are the memories that I remember. So when I was sitting in that hospital room, I didn't feel triggered or sad from the loss. I felt grateful. I felt strong. I felt trained. And I think that's why I kept thinking, you're in training for something bigger. Because here I was again, I could not have imagined that I would be sitting in that room again 15 years later. I just never in my imagination did I think that I would be in front of that sign, turning it around and refusing to let it be a part of the room again. Never in my life. But again, I came across the word bigger. And because I was in a situation where my sister was encountering surgery and a diagnosis, and it felt heavy, it was a heavy situation, I thought about bigger again. Like, does it just get heavier? Does it get harder? Is bigger more challenging? But here's the thing. I don't believe that events are good or bad. I believe they're neutral, but for what we make them mean. So the idea that bigger means worse is really not applicable, because I don't believe that there is better or worse. Rather, how we interpret the situation. It's only worse if we choose to look at it that way, right? Because it means something to us because of our interpretation of the event. So it can't be bigger means more challenging or worse necessarily, even though we could interpret it. That could be an interpretation of it. But then my brother said something else that helped me connect the dots and really, really helped me close the loop on this. I went downstairs with my brother to get something to eat while we were waiting for my sister's to get out of her procedure. And we were just talking about our life and growing up and all that kind of stuff. You know, when somebody is in a big surgery like that, you tend to take a trip down memory lane with your family members. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation, but it happens. And you recall war stories. And my brother looked at me and he said, "Man, Caro, we've really put you through the ringer, my sister and I. Like, you've had to take care of both of us at different times. And you've been through a lot with us. And also with your dad, like, you've really had to go through a lot of stuff." And when he said that, I was like, I know, but I've always felt like that's because I was chosen. I was chosen to study human behavior, to witness transformations, to be a part of people's resilient stories, hero stories, transformation journeys. I feel like I've just been chosen to live these stories so then I can help other people cope with their own life by bringing meaning to these difficult moments. And he looked at me and he was like, "Yeah, but you're just so strong." It was in that moment that I got it. You see, all those years with my father, I was there taking care of him for sure. But I was also there learning from him. My father was a light, an absolute light. And no matter how hard his circumstances got, he was training me to be the light, to be steady, to be stoic, to be joyful, to bring humor, to understand that I was capable and that I was strong and that I could be the lighthouse. For many years, everything that I went through as the apprentice. And it occurred to me that what you're in training for something bigger meant in that moment for me was that I am no longer the apprentice. I'm the legacy. And I don't say that to be boastful or prideful, like, you know, wearing it like a trophy. I say that as a choice, as a responsibility, as a decision. I choose to carry that light forward. I choose to be strong and capable and steady. All those years, my father, he taught me that worry was a misuse of the imagination. He taught me the Seneca principle. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. That it is our responsibility to live in the present moment and to use humor and use joy to help each other cope with life as it's presented to us. The reason that I live by the mantra, you are in training for something bigger, is because when you connect the dots, you can always find the lessons. Always. So here's what I want for you. If you have been through challenges, if you have been through real things, if you've been put in the ringer, if you've been knocked down a few times, but you're still in the ring, I want you to ask yourself a question. Not, why did this happen to me? Why me? No. I want you to ask yourself, what am I choosing to make this mean? If this were training me for something bigger, what will that be? If I really believed that this was training me for something bigger, what tools am I putting in my toolbox from this experience? What am I learning? Who am I becoming? What will I know better next time? How will I be stronger? Will you know where to look for the signs so that you can turn it around? Will you be the light amidst the pain? Will you be the strong one, the capable one, the steady one? Or are you the one that's learning right now? And that's okay too. Sometimes in this life, we are the hero of the story, which means we are struggling and overcoming the challenges and finding our way to victory. Or we are the guide, which means we've been training for something bigger, and now we can look back and we can guide those that come along with us. But we never have to choose to be the victim. There's always a victim, but we don't ever have to choose to be the victim. That's not a role we have to choose. So that is what I've been thinking about this week as I've sat there with my sister, feeling so grateful that she is doing so much better, that we've had the best case scenario by every stretch of the imagination. I was actually sharing with my well group last week before the surgery. I was explaining to them how for Imagine May, I was really tapping into that quote that I mentioned. We suffer more in imagination than in reality. And how I chose to use imagination differently for this experience with my sister than using it for pain. So I chose to use my imagination to imagine that she was going to do well in this surgery, to imagine that everything was going to work out, to imagine that she wouldn't even need the surgery, which was silly because I knew she would need to have the surgery. But we get to use our imaginations for whatever we want. Imagination is just that. It's an imagination. We can imagine the impossible. We can imagine whatever we want. And it's not the same, by the way, to imagine something to be true. It's not the same thing as saying, I know she's not going to need the surgery. I know she's going to be okay. I know that the circumstances are going to be exactly as I want them to be. I don't play that game. I find that to be toxic positivity. And, I love people that are of faith and like, I have faith, she's going to be fine. But sometimes she's not fine per our definition. And I think we get to be real about that. But imagination, you could use your imagination for whatever you want. So that's what I chose to use my imagination for this week. That's how I chose to show up for this experience. And I didn't realize when this all started and as I was getting ready for this surgery that I was going to have this full circle moment at my dad's hospital. In fact, my sister wasn't supposed to be operated at that hospital. She was going to be operated at Baptist, which is a different hospital in Miami. And then there was an issue with insurance and she ended up being operated at UM. So I was under a completely different premise. And then I got there and I had this opportunity to understand this mantra that came to me so many years ago and that I've honored and I've believed in and I've used. And I've also seek to understand fully. It's taken me this long to understand it fully. So as you are in training for something bigger, understand that bigger may not be better or worse, harder or easier, but rather the higher version of yourself, a bigger and better version of yourself. That is what I want to leave you with today. I hope this episode has served you well. If it resonates with you and you have somebody that needs to hear this message, go ahead and send this to your friend. Share this message. And if you want more stories like this, more deep reflections, real-time things that are happening every week in my life, I deliver a love letter to your inbox every Sunday where I write weekly reflections, moments of clarity, and real-time stories that shift your perspective and support you in bringing meaning to your own life. So make sure that you sign up. You can go to the show notes and subscribe there. So that's all I've got for you today. Next week, we'll start getting ready to step into a new month with a new theme and new lessons for us to learn. See you next week. Bye. That's it for today's episode. Thanks so much for being here. I am deeply, deeply grateful to connect. If you're loving this podcast, I'd love if you'd follow, rate, or leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Those reviews help us so, so much. And if you know of someone who could really use a voice like mine in their head, please share this episode with them. Now, if you're feeling called to keep the conversation going, come join us inside the Blissin' Up community on Facebook. It is a free space to reflect and root into intention together. You can find the link in the show notes or just search Blissin' Up with Caroline de Posada on Facebook. I'd love to welcome you in. Until next time, take care and keep noticing the sparks of bliss in your life.